And to introduce and moderate this session, I'd like to hand over to Michael Estevez, who's the EVP and Managing Director of Public Affairs and Crisis at BCW. Michael, over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome, and I will more than gladly pass things over to my colleague, Drew O'Brien, who's going to be moderating today's session.
Great, and thanks a lot, Michael. So as was mentioned, we're gathered here this morning to talk about the emerging role of data as it applies to PR and communications crises. So if you've joined us this morning, you no doubt have experience or interest in crisis response. You might be inside a company or organization, you might be a reporter or have an influencing presence on social media. Or like my colleagues and I at BCW, you might be a consultant and strategic advisor on crisis. Whatever your reason, we're delighted to have you. So with us this morning are three consummate professionals in this space. I'm going to introduce them quickly. I'm going to get right into the substance of the conversation in the program. So with us, we have Paul Quigley, the CEO of, the founder and CEO of NewsWhip. We have Shireen Abadi, who's Associate Managing Director, Forensic Investigations and Intelligence at Kroll. And then we already heard from my colleague, Michael Estevez, who has been in the crisis submarine a time or two with myself. So great panel, and looking forward to a great conversation this morning. So I'm going to start, Paul Quigley, I'm going to go right to you. No organization in the world is more tapped into real-time data around news and content than NewsWhip. From your perspective as founder and CEO, what is the benefit of data in real time as it applies to PR crises?
Thanks for a really generous introduction there, Drew. And that's a great question because more data is not always better. If you're managing a crisis, you're going to want data that's relevant to the questions that you want to answer. So with that context in mind, I'd say there's three places we see real-time data being used today in crisis. There's understanding the crisis, taking the right action on the crisis, and then predicting and planning the next moves coming out from a crisis. So first, in understanding a crisis, or even deciding whether something is a crisis at all. For example, an unflattering story about your company is published. Should you respond? And what real-time data does is it lets you quantify the impact of that story very quickly. Is it getting public interest, social media engagement? Are follow-on stories appearing? Is there discussion on Reddit, discussion on Twitter? What's the quality of that discussion? And as we know, many negative stories do not, in fact, cause the world to end. And with real-time data, you can actually see that and maybe confirm your hunch that this story is not such a big deal and counsel a response that's appropriate to it. And that leads me to the second thing, which is, real-time data can help you take action in a crisis. And here we'd see a wave of coverage is happening about an issue important to your company. What are the narrative elements that people are taking an interest in? And you can see this from which stories are spreading the most quickly and getting the most public interest, which outlets are publishing the stories getting the most interest, and which journalists and influencers are driving interest. So you can kind of get a bit of a 360 and understand the issue better. And I suppose finally then where we have a particular specialization as well at NewsWhip is in using real-time data to predict the trajectory of a crisis. And what our platform does is it tracks engagement in real time, and what that allows us to do is model future engagement. And the key to any good prediction is recent, accurate data, a good model, and a lack of bias. And we feed our algorithms with very recent and accurate data, and they can give us a pretty unbiased picture of where the next few hours of a story is going to go. And that means people are making decisions with a predictive model and some firm ground in place. And I think the most interesting thing about all of this data, especially the predictive data, is actually it calms people. Which is another helpful side effect in a crisis. You can see what's happening, you have more of a handle on it, and that's a benefit in itself as well. We have the quantified data, and even if there's bad news, we kind of know how bad it is and can make better decisions and from a better place too.
Paul, that was a great way to end the whole calming people idea, because if we've been there, we all know that anxious clients, anxious colleagues can sometimes get in the way. So, so the calming influence of data might be a takeaway for everybody here. I'm going to go to Michael Estevez. Michael, you've had a long career that has spanned government, law, public relations. You started a long time ago doing all this. You're still very young, but you've been doing this a long time, and you have unique perspective when you put all those parts together. Prior to media and internet data, what kind of information or data was utilized to guide PR responses to crisis? How did this work before?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the qualifier that I started this very young. I was about 12 when I started.
Yeah.
You know, well, and in truth, I started about 25 years ago. And frankly, the internet, it existed, but it was still new, right? And smartphones were still a long way off. You know, mobile phone, cell phone adoption was still early. So, you know, when it came to managing a crisis using data, there was precious little. And, you know, the PR industry at the time, you know, I think really was struggling with the notion of measurement and how do we, you know, prove our value. And the problem was just even exacerbated in crisis communications. So we used a lot of the same, you know, the same metrics in some ways we still use today. You know, we would look at the media coverage, sentiment, and tone, right? Positive, negative, neutral, which we still look at. But we would also look at things like print circulation, right? We would look at where was the article placed? Front page, above the fold, below the fold, or, you know, front page of the business section. You know, with television, it was, you know, what network did the segment appear on? But it was all very high level, right? There was not that ability to really look at how a specific article was generating follow-on coverage unless that specific story of record was cited in other news coverage, or that article clearly was the first story that led to additional coverage. And so, you know, today, the real-time data in all the ways that Paul just described, that real-time data, but expressly the ability to track specific articles or mentions and understand how that is influencing additional coverage through things like link backs, the ability to see what reporters are writing about a particular topic using analytics has completely changed the game. And so, you know, if there's one takeaway, it's that there is absolutely real-time data available in order to manage crises, but the caveat is you have to understand how to apply it and use it in a crisis, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Great. I think one of the things that Paul and Michael just sort of alluded to is scale, and I want to pivot to Shireen Abadi for a moment. Shireen, in a word, your business at Kroll is risk, identifying it, navigating it, and advising clients and partners, hopefully, about how to come out whole on the other side. But despite all that, crises happen along the way. Can you tell us, from your perspective, how data can be helpful in determining the scale of a crisis?
Absolutely. So I think sort of before we start to understand scale, we have to understand what the source is. So something might go viral, but if that virality is inorganic, it might be irrelevant, right? It's not affecting your shareholders, your stakeholders, and things like that. So when a client comes to us, they generally have some form of a crisis or a problem. And in order for us to solve that problem, we have to understand what its root cause is. In most simple terms, right? Where is the crisis coming from? What's sort of patient zero, if you will? When we analyze data, it gives us this solid foundation of where we can begin to explore what the root causes are. Because if we don't know what the root causes are, we can't begin to attack it. And if we don't know what the root causes are, how are we possibly going to understand the impact of the scale and whether or not that scale is even relevant to our client? So I'll kind of give an example that can explain this a little bit. You know, we had a client, they came to us, their stock had dropped 40%. They were facing a QTM suit from shareholders saying that they did not take due care. They were There had been this short report that had come out. It was very aggressively attacking one of their new product launches. It had some disinformation in it, some misinformation in it. And so they came to us trying to understand what to do, essentially. And so our first question was, what's the root cause? Is the report the root cause of the stock price falling? And if so, let's understand who wrote the report, why they wrote the report, and how the report spread, right? Is it the reason that shareholders began making sell decisions on their stock? And so we did some digging and we were able to find that, in fact, this negative report had gone viral. We looked at the evolution and the spread of the information. But what we noticed is that virality for some period of time was inorganic. So it was shared and engaged in and retweeted and reshared and liked and spread by people who were responsible for writing the report or people that were closely associated with it. And so if you think of it in that, the scale wasn't that important. These were all people who were writing the report anyway. It wasn't affecting your average shareholder. But what we began to see is that once it got enough spread that was inorganic, it started to gain traction among organic investors and people who were industry professionals, began being shared in forums and on sites that were relevant to our clients' industry. It began to gain a lot of traction just in the market in general. And we noticed that when it started to gain that organic traction was when the stock price began to fall and you saw a lot of sell orders, right? So in that sense, the scale of it was actually quite relevant because the scale, although it becomes this big, but it's inorganic, it's not affecting their stock price. Therefore, it doesn't matter how big it is. But once it begins to affect their stock price, we're looking at that spread, where it's going, how big it's getting, and how exponential it's spreading. So in this particular case, it was really important for us to understand the correlation between the report, the spread of the report, and the fall in the share price, because that was the crisis, was the share price. Once we understood that, we were able to give our client enough information that they could have a meeting with their shareholders, they could address the report and some of the information in it that was inaccurate. They could address the ketam suit that they were facing, and they could go on the offensive against some of the bad actors that had written the report, that held short positions in it, that stood to gain financially, and that didn't disclose any of that information.
Shereen, I'm gonna. That was really good and a very helpful example. I'm gonna keep you front and center for a minute. And it sounded like there was a moment or a series of moments where you talked about the report, the spread of the report, and the fall of the stock price as sort of the moments in time. Was there ever a moment in there where again, using data, quantitative info, was there ever a moment in there where you could sort of use that knowledge that you had, that insight to contain the crisis or counteract it in real time?
Yeah,
to jump
absolutely.
on it, to jump
absolutely.
on it.
Yeah, precisely. So, in order to contain a crisis, you have to know where it's coming from. And in this case, once we knew where it was coming from, they were able to, they could take the short report down because it contained actually false information. They were able to combat it a little bit by talking to their shareholders. So that restored a little bit of shareholder confidence, a little bit of confidence in the market. It sort of stopped the very sharp decline in their stock price. And so that was the containing part, which was really useful. Giving that information. And I think, to just take it one step further, you're not just trying to contain, right? You want to get back, you want to be whole, like you said in the very beginning. How do you get whole? In this case, they had to go on the offensive. They had a ketam suit that they're defending, so they dealt with that, which was helpful because they had some information to basically say, no, it wasn't us not taking due care, it was this and this that happened. But then the offensive piece was going out against those bad actors who had put this information out, again, who stood to gain financially, who were disingenuous with their motives for writing the report, and then also talking about how it spread inorganically. So there was a lot in the data that allowed them to both contain it and to counteract it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. That was great. Michael Estevez, I'm going to come back to you. From, again, just using sort of the perspective of the arc of your career from an investigative standpoint, is there a value add or role that real-time data can play when addressing a crisis? And Paul had mentioned sort of the calming effect. I'm coming back to that now. Is there something in those early moments when there may not be a lot of qualitative information to be gleaned, but but access to data and sort of what happens then?
Yeah, so the good news is the short answer is yes, right? There is data available. You know, at the onset of a crisis, even if the questions aren't expressly asked, the implicit questions that we're getting, that I'm getting is how bad is this? And how bad do you think this may get? And historically, there was really no way to answer those questions based on anything other than intuition. But now there are the data tools that exist to help you answer that if you know how to apply them. And you know, and let me just also say though that you still need to apply experience and judgment in crisis communications management. And in fact, just last evening, you know, we had a news media inquiry come in and we had to make an assessment. Do we respond to this inquiry or not? There was no data yet to be had because there was no media coverage. But in those instances, when there is coverage, news coverage and or social media conversation in the early hours, there are data tools available. And the key metrics that I look at, there are three in those first few hours. First is what I call resonance, which is just a way of saying number of shares on social media and social reactions. So sharing especially is important because why do people share things online? They share them because, frankly, it's going to elevate their personal status, right? I consider this article to be important and influential, so I'm going to share it with my social network so I can kind of lead this conversation within my own social network. The other is velocity. And so that's, for me, that's increase or decrease of shares hour over hour. So if you had 1,000 shares of a negative story within hour one, but then there are 4,000 shares in hour two, that is not a trend that we like to see. But conversely, you know, if there's 4,000 shares in hour one and it drops down to 1,000 in hour two, that's a good trend. It's not dispositive, but it's signal, and it's a reliable signal. And then the last is total reach, which in my view is a lagging indicator. You know, I think one of the big mistakes that people make is to say, well, once total volume reaches X number, then we'll respond. Well, it's already too late, right? If that is your upper threshold of what's a problem, and you wait until you reach that threshold to respond, you're already too late. So, you know, again, this goes back to understanding how to apply the data and using the right data tools that are going to give you that signal that will help you get out in front of a crisis if it's moving against you.
Great. Intuition and judgment, Michael. Two very good relevant words here. I'm going to go back to Paul. Again, Paul, using that up to the minute perspective that NewsWhip excels at, is it possible that data can tell us the behavioral ramifications of the crisis? Michael just talked a little bit about that, I think, but and if so, how is that going to be helpful in addressing the crisis?
That's another really interesting question, because we're kind of getting to the limits maybe of what computers are good at and some of the stuff that people are better at. So we should kind of draw a line between them. I mean, we're not talking about high frequency trading here where you're hardwiring whether we send press releases into, you know, as Michael was saying, the social velocity of a story. Okay, it's above 6,000, so computers send press release, right? It's super. What we're doing with real-time data is we're informing the work of comms professionals, and they know the internal context, the risk tolerance, goals of their clients and companies. And so what we're doing here, where computers can be good on behavioral ramifications, is, you know, how fast something is spreading. And we can, if the story is boycott brand X, then that's going to be significant, and we can see downstream behavioral consequences of that. And maybe another kind of place where big data can play a real-time role is in categories of crisis. And we've seen this happen. There's certain kind of emergent categories, like a data breach is almost a category of a crisis now. And when our team write crisis reports, it's one of those, or product recall, where this summer there were strikes at Frito-Lay and Nabisco. And you do see some patterns in those. So we can say, okay, are we following an expected model of, public interest with this story over time? Like after the Frito-Lay and Nabisco strike stories both started, it was some days before they actually picked up much public interest. And the media interest, and at least one of those was quite lagging after the public interest. And when you look at a few of those, and then you overlay that insight onto a real-time situation, you can say, okay, well, is this behaving as this kind of an immediate event normally behaves? Now, as you can imagine, there'll always be exceptions to these things, but we're putting maybe some kind of outline, guardrails or expectations around what we think good and bad looks like, and some parameters that help us make decisions. So that's probably what we'd say about behavioral ramifications, but people are really good at understanding other people, and computers aren't that good at it yet. So it's more where you're crunching the big numbers that computers can, I think, help and give a bit of insight into the world. But there's always an interpreter who's deciding what to do next.
Great. Thank you, Paul. We are moving along in the program. I want to leave some time for Q&A at the end if there is in fact it. I'm gonna cut to what I would call a lightning round right now. Shireen, what are some client examples or news story examples that you can share which have been influenced or guided by internet? Got a quick one?
So yeah, I can think of a recent one. We had a client come to us, and they're a provider and distributor of online events. And they came to us because there was a fairly egregious pirating of one of their events. The estimated loss was like $200 million in pay-per-view viewing, because the pirates were selling it for $9.99, whereas the client was selling it for $50 a pop. So you can imagine, several million people viewing it at $9.99, and you're not getting that revenue. So, they'd come to us to try and understand not how their information was pirated. That was one segment of the investigation, but who did it, so that they could fight against it. And for us, it was taking these sort of anonymous actors on these semi-anonymous platforms and trying to work backwards to a source, to an individual, to a real human, as opposed to an avatar. And it was really interesting to look at how people interact on the internet. So you may have an anonymous account, and you look at who were the first people to like that account. Which accounts did that person like first, or that avatar like first? When you look at those accounts, and are there any commonalities? And then when you eventually get to an account that has a real person behind it, you find that you can find little breadcrumbs of information. So for example, we have avatar account over here, the first 5 people to like avatar account, which, arguably maybe knew about it, right? You take a look at those accounts, and you find that there's a lot of similarities in their friend groups or in their engagement. And then you start to dig into that, and ultimately, make a really long story short, we were able to identify the vast majority of the pirates who were operating anonymously online by using this sort of social media information and engagement.
Great. Michael, do you have one? You got an example?
Yeah, actually, I have 2 on opposite ends of the spectrum in the last year. So last year, we had a client that was a consumer packaged goods company whose CEO made some comments that were controversial in Washington, D.C. There was tremendous news media coverage of those comments, within the context of the presidential campaign. And so they came to us to help manage the media relations. But when we looked at the analytics, we found that the social media conversation vastly was outpacing the news media coverage by a factor of 10. And so we pivoted our strategy to focus especially on social media because we were also able to determine that customers were also chatting online. And so we created a whole content management strategy on social media. We responded to news media inquiries, obviously, but our focus was on social media. Complete opposite. Just recently, we have a major US employer that was targeted by an activist group. Tremendous social media conversation by that group, members associated by that group. But when we look at the analytics, the engagement is extraordinarily low. So we pulled back on social media, kept our powder dry, if you will. Again, responding to news media inquiries, which is where that situation is playing out. And it's actually turned out to be a very low profile incident. But if you looked at the social media content and just looked at it on surface value, you would think that this was a major crisis, but when in fact the data tells a completely different story.
Great, thanks. I'm going to do another quick lightning round question. I'm going to ask Paul, what are some of the best practices or things to keep in mind that you would share with comms professionals looking to use real-time data? Anybody, anything for the meal?
I think shifting to using real-time data to inform decisions it's a bit of an organizational shift. It's a bit of a change in how you do business within a comms team and how you work. I learned that from a head of onboarding, Aisling, on our team, who works with a lot of teams that are kind of onboarding and bringing NewsWhip into into how they work. And she's realized, she said, we're in the business of organizational change a bit. And we, if we're going to be using real-time data from a dashboard to inform whether we send the press release here or there, that's just it's a new way of thinking. And I think what we found we almost always need is some kind of an organizational champion for that to happen. And I think even with neat technology, it won't happen without some kind of willingness and maybe a bit of a champion who kind of has a bit of vision to say, okay, we can do these 3 things differently. Let's figure out how to do that. And I think that's a really important first step in bringing real-time data in.
Great. Michael, any example on that front for you?
Yeah, just in terms of best practices, I would just say as a key takeaway, data really has value when you have something to compare it to. So I mentioned earlier about escalation in shares from hour 1 to hour 2, right? And so hour 1 is 1,000, hour 2, let's say it's 5,000. Well, 5,000 can be a lot, or it can be insignificant depending on your company or brand. And so you need to have an understanding, number one, of what is I call it the circadian rhythm, right, of the social conversation and the mentions about your company. And number two, I think as a key takeaway, I refer to this as predictive listening. So oftentimes when you're listening online for mentions relevant to your company or brand, the taxonomy is specific and adjacent to your reputation and your brand. But in order to spot issues before they escalate into crises, you have to take a wider view. And that means being deliberate in your taxonomy to focus on topics and issues relevant to your company, but don't actually mention your company or your industry or your competitors. And then have the SOPs, right? Have the governance around that to deliberately scan and identify issues before they become crises. And again, artificial intelligence may be able to do that one day, but for now, I think you still need a good issues management crisis team to be able to sift through that data and spot patterns before they become adjacent issues or crises to your company.
Great. We are at time. Let's hear it for the panel and your insight and your time. Council, we really appreciate it. If I have a set of takeaways, it's be smart, be quick, use data, be human. They all still need us. So thanks everybody for joining this morning, and we will see you all soon.